The justice of the peace charged $2 for a wedding and $4 for a divorce, and everyone in Colby, Kansas, knew which one Hattie Crane had come for. She had stepped off the eastbound Burlington that morning with a trunk, a carpetbag, and a letter from a man named Elias Voss, describing himself as a widower of 38 with one boy and 300 acres of winter wheat ground. He had sent the train fare. He had sent a second letter correcting the first. It was 160 acres, and the boy was 8, and the wheat had gone to rust the previous autumn. Hattie had read both letters on the train and sat with her hands in her lap for the last 100 miles, thinking about the gap between them. Elias Voss was waiting at the depot. He was taller than she had expected, which meant nothing. He held his hat against his chest and studied her the way a man studies a bill come due. Not unkind. Reckoning, he said he appreciated her making the trip. He said the boy was at school. He said there was time before the justice closed his office, if she was willing. The price is $2, Hattie said. He blinked at that. You wrote it in your first letter. The cost of the license. She set down the carpetbag. I know what I came for, Miss Voss. I am only telling you I know what it costs. That was how Elias Voss learned that Hattie Crane was not going to be easy to feel sorry for. They were married at 3:30. The justice's wife witnessed it and gave Hattie a hard candy from a dish on the desk. The ring was his mother's, which he told her only after he had put it on, as if expecting her to object. She did not object. It was a plain gold band worn thin on the inside, which meant his mother had worn it a long time, which meant something about the family she was marrying into, though she could not yet say what. The boy's name was Thomas Voss, and he was waiting on the porch steps when they drove the wagon up the lane. He was not what she had pictured. 8 years old and small for it, with his father's dark brows and a serious set to his mouth that belonged to a much older face. He stood up when the wagon stopped. He glanced at his father. He glanced at her. Then he picked up her carpetbag from where Elias had set it in the dust and carried it toward the door without being asked. Hattie watched him go. He doesn't say much, Elias said. He climbed down from the wagon seat and offered his hand to help her down. He hasn't since his mother. When was that? 2 years and 4 months ago. She noted the precision of it. She filed it alongside the 2 letters, the first one too generous and the second one true, and followed her husband into the house. The house was worn in the way of houses where a woman had been absent long enough for things to stop being tended and not long enough for the man to have learned why the tending mattered. The curtains in the kitchen were sun-faded to a color that might once have been blue. There was a Bible on the mantel with a pressed flower inside the front cover, which she did not touch. The stove needed blacking. The larder was organized in the way a child organizes things, by size rather than by use, so that the salt sat beside the lamp oil and the dried beans were in a crock behind the vinegar. Thomas brought her trunk in from the wagon without being asked to do that either. She watched him set it at the foot of the bed in the small room off the kitchen that Elias had told her was hers. Not theirs. He had said this plainly on the drive from town. Without apology, she would have the room off the kitchen and he would have the loft. It was a practical arrangement, he said. She had said she understood. And she did. And she was grateful for it, though she did not say that part. Thomas set the trunk down carefully and straightened up. Do you know anything about animals? He asked. Some. We have a ewe that's been off her feed for 3 days. Pa checked her. He doesn't know what's wrong. Hattie set her carpetbag on the trunk. Show me. She had learned what she knew about animals from her grandmother, who had been a practical woman on a hardscrabble farm in eastern Missouri and had believed that the best education for a girl was whatever kept things alive. Hattie had learned to read a sick animal the way her grandmother taught her, start at the nose and work back. A dry nose meant fever. A tucked flank meant gut pain. Eyes half shut in daylight meant something had been going on longer than 3 days. The ewe was a Romney cross, dirty white and round-barreled, standing at the back of the small pen with her head low and her left foreleg held slightly off the ground. Hattie climbed through the fence rails and moved slowly and crouched beside the leg. The fetlock was hot to the touch and swollen above the hoof. She ran her thumb along the hoof wall and found the soft spot on the near side. "Foot rot," she said. Early, you caught it. Thomas was on the fence rail watching her. Elias had come up behind him. "Can you treat it?" Elias asked. "If you have copper sulfate and clean water and a dry place to keep her separate for a week, yes," she stood. "Turpentine would help if you have it. And a narrow blade." He had the copper sulfate in the barn. He had the turpentine. He did not have the narrow blade she wanted, but he had a farrier's knife with a thin point, and she worked with that, cleaning the lesion in the cleft of the hoof with a precision that made Elias go still and watch. She packed the wound with a copper sulfate paste she mixed in the palm of her hand and wrapped the hoof in a strip she tore from an old flour sack. The ewe stood for it better than some animals she had treated, shifting once and then settling. When she straightened up and washed her hands in the bucket Thomas had brought, the boy regarded her with a new quality of attention. "Grandmother Voss said you could tell a good woman by how she handles a sick animal," he said. "Your grandmother sounds like a sensible person." "She died before I was born." He handed her the rag from the fence post. "Pa said she would have liked you." Elias was considering something past the fence line when Hattie glanced at him, and she understood from the line of his jaw that he had not said that, or if he had not meant for Thomas to repeat it. It was October, which meant the work of the farm was the work of preparing for winter, the late garden to put up, the root cellar to finish stocking, the water trough insulation to lay in before the first hard freeze. Elias told her these things over supper on the first evening, not as orders, but as an accounting, the way you tell a business partner where things stand. She listened and asked 2 questions, and he answered them. Thomas ate quietly and watched them both. In the second week, she found a system in the larder that made sense and reorganized it. She did not ask permission. She did not explain it afterward. She simply left it in order and went on. Elias noticed. He said nothing. She took that as its own kind of answer. In the third week, Elias came in from the south field at midday with a cut on his forearm from a fence wire, deep enough to need closing. She sat him at the kitchen table and cleaned it with carbolic and closed it with 3 neat stitches using the curved needle she kept in her grandmother's kit, which she had brought in the carpet bag along with the copper sulfate and a collection of dried herbs her grandmother had pressed and labeled in small paper packets. He watched her work without moving his arm, which not every man could manage. "You trained for this?" he asked. "My grandmother trained me. She said doctors were expensive and far away, and a woman with common sense and steady hands could manage most of what wasn't a broken bone." Most? She was a practical woman. He was quiet while she tied off the last suture. "Then, my wife was afraid of blood." Hattie clipped the thread. "A lot of people are. It made things hard on the farm. I expect it did." She was not going to pretend she hadn't understood him. He was not going to pretend he hadn't said it. They left it at that, which was the first real thing that passed between them that was not practical arrangement. Thomas, sitting at the far end of the table with his schoolbook, did not glance up, but his pencil had stopped moving for a while. The neighbor woman came in the 5th week. Her name was Mrs. Aldrich, and she drove over from the farm to the east with a covered dish and a face arranged in the shape of kindness. She sat at Hattie's kitchen table and drank the coffee Hattie poured and said that everyone in the county was glad Elias had finally found someone, Just glad. What a relief for poor Thomas. And wasn't it a pity that Hattie hadn't arrived before the harvest, because the Ladies' Aid had put up an enormous amount of preserves, and it would have been nice to have her help. She said this last thing with her eyes on the shelves, where Hattie's own putting up was ranked in clean rows: 14 quarts of tomatoes, 9 of apple butter, 6 of wild plum jam she had made from fruit Thomas had shown her along the creek, 8 pints of pickled beets. She had also put up 4 dozen eggs in water glass and rendered the lard from a shote Elias had slaughtered, which accounted for the 14 additional jars on the lower shelf. Mrs. Aldrich was not a cruel woman. Hattie had met enough cruel women to know the difference. Mrs. Aldrich was simply a woman who had been the closest available neighbor for 2 years and had opinions about what was needed, and she found Hattie's competence slightly inconvenient. There was also, Hattie suspected, a quality of ownership that comes to women who have looked after a family from the outside for a long time. She had driven over in the cold twice a month for 2 years and 4 months. She had brought broth when Thomas was sick and firewood when the pile ran short. She had earned something by that, and Hattie did not entirely begrudge her. But the shelf of jars was a fact, and Mrs. Aldrich's eyes were on it. "You've certainly been busy," she said, which was the kind of thing you say when you want to say something else. "There's a lot of winter ahead," Hattie said, which was true and also an answer to the thing she had actually meant. They finished their coffee with ordinary conversation about the road condition and the Pulliam family's new barn, and when Mrs. Aldrich left, she said she hoped they would see Hattie at the Ladies' Aid, which was both an invitation and a measuring. When she was gone, Thomas came in from the back porch where he had been sitting and considered the covered dish she had left. "She brought that same dish to every family when something happened," he said. "Ma said it tasted like boiled nothing." Hattie pressed her lips together. "It does," Thomas said seriously. "I checked." She laughed then, a short surprised sound, and Thomas's expression shifted into something that was not quite a smile, but was what a smile grows from in a child who has stopped expecting reasons to make one. She thought about that later, while she was straining the evening milk. She thought about a child who kept a private accounting of what the adults had failed to mention, who carried his grandmother's standards around in his chest like a plumb line, who had picked up her carpetbag on the day of her arrival without being asked or thanked. She thought about what it cost a child to stay ready. The trouble arrived in the 7th week, as trouble tends to arrive, from a direction no one had been watching. Elias had a note of credit at the grain merchant in Colby, carried forward from the previous year when the wheat went to rust. The merchant sent a letter in October stating that the note was due by the 1st of December and that he would be obliged if Mr. Voss could make arrangements. The amount was $91. Elias showed her the letter at supper. He did not explain why he was showing her. He set it beside her plate and poured his coffee and sat down. She read it. She turned it over to see if there was anything on the back. There was not. "The winter wheat is in? 2 weeks ago. And it looks good? Best stand I've had in 3 years. But you can't sell it before December. I could sell it green. Take a loss. Or?" He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "There's a man named Pulliam who's been after the South 40 for 2 years. He'd pay cash and he'd pay fast." She set the letter down. $91 was not a ruinous amount in a good year. It was a ruinous amount in the year after a rust year, when a man was already running thin on capital and carrying a note at the merchant. She thought about the South 40, which she had walked twice now. Good ground, well drained, the kind of ground that grew wheat without arguing. She thought about what it cost to sell ground. Not just the dollars. The kind of cost that doesn't go on a ledger, but sits in a man's chest when he drives past the fence line that used to be his. "What does the South 40 clear in a good year?" he told her. She did the arithmetic in her head, which took her about 4 seconds, and set the letter down. "Sell the green wheat at a loss before you sell that ground," she said. "The loss this year costs you less than the income you'd lose every year. The South 40 isn't yours." He was quiet for a moment. "I came to the same conclusion," he said. "I wanted to know if you did." She held his eyes for a beat, understanding that this was its own kind of statement, and returned to her plate. Thomas was watching them both over the rim of his cup. He had taken to drinking his milk hot in the evenings, with a spoonful of the honey Hattie had traded Mrs. Pulliam's daughter for. Hattie had negotiated this arrangement herself, having observed that the Pulliam girl came to church with dress hems that were always slightly crooked, and concluded she would rather have someone to hem them properly than cash. Thomas thought this was the most interesting transaction he had ever witnessed, and had asked her to explain it twice. "The South 40 stays," Elias said. "Not to either of them in particular. To the room." Thomas nodded as if this were obvious. He returned to his milk. It was the second Saturday of November when Thomas showed her the Bible. She had been in the house for 7 weeks. She had treated the ewe through to full recovery, put up enough provisions to carry 3 people through to March, hemmed 4 dresses for the Pulliam girl at 2 jars of honey apiece, stitched Elias's arm and watched the scar form clean, reorganized the larder twice more as the root cellar stock changed shape, and learned that Thomas woke at 5:30 every morning and could not be made to sleep later, that he kept a collection of hawk feathers in a tin box under his bed, and that he had his mother's habit of going very still when something mattered to him. He brought the Bible from the mantel and set it on the kitchen table in front of her. She did not touch it. It was the family Bible, brown leather, well worn at the spine, a brass clasp that had lost its pin and been replaced with a strip of rawhide. The pressed flower was still in the front cover, a little more flattened than before. "Open it," Thomas said. She opened it. The front pages held the family record, births, deaths, marriages, written in different hands across 2 generations. At the bottom of the page, below Elias's name and the date of his first marriage and below his wife's death 2 years and 4 months ago, Thomas had written in his careful schoolboy hand, Harriet Crane Voss. Arrived October the 4th. He had used ink. He had drawn a careful line under the entry to separate it from the names above, the way the entries for his grandfather and grandmother were separated from each other. She put her hand flat on the page. "I put it in 3 weeks ago," Thomas said. He was standing very straight. "Pa said he would do it, but he hadn't yet, so I did." She considered the entry for a long time. Her name, her married name, written in a child's careful hand and left here to be found in the ordinary way, as if it had always been there, as if she had always been expected. Thomas, yes, this was a kind thing. He thought about this for a moment. "Grandmother Voss put everybody in who mattered," he said. "She said the Bible was for the ones who stayed." Hattie closed the book carefully, the way you close something you are going to need again. That night she sat on the edge of her bed after Thomas was asleep and Elias was in the loft, and the house was quiet, and she thought about what staying meant. She had come here for the practical reason, the same reason she had taken work as a seamstress at 14 and as a household nurse at 22, and had answered an advertisement in a Kansas City paper at 29, and all the practical reasons had been fine. She had been fine. She had managed. She had managed for a long time. There was a pride in managing that she had worn as long as she could remember. The way a coat can become so familiar you stop noticing it is the only one you have. The wind was up against the north side of the house. She could hear the water trough chain knock once, twice, and then go still. She was thinking about Thomas standing straight at the kitchen table, holding that book open with both hands, waiting for her to see what he had done. She was still sitting there when she heard Elias's step on the loft ladder. He came into the kitchen, and she heard him fill a basin at the pump, and then the scrape of the stove door and the sound of wood settling. He was heating the water. She heard all of this through the wall. When he knocked on her doorframe, which was standing open, he was holding the basin with both hands, and there was steam rising off it in the cold air. "For your face," he said. "The pump runs cold tonight," and I thought. He stopped there. He was not a man who explained himself easily, and he had run out of the sentence before he reached the end of what he meant. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at what he was holding. No one had done that. In all the years of managing and being managed and finding the practical reason and being fine, no one had heated water and carried it to her at the end of a cold night. Not because they had been asked, not because it was their job, because they had thought to. She did not try to stop it. She put her face in her hands and let it come, the shaking kind of crying that has nothing of sadness in it, that is only the body releasing something it has been holding in the shape of adequate for a very long time. Elias stood in the doorway. He did not back away. He set the basin on the floor beside her and pulled the chair from the corner and sat down in it and waited, the way a man waits who has decided not to leave. When she could speak, "It isn't that I am unhappy." "I know," he said. She wiped her face with the back of her wrist. "Thomas told me what you said about the Bible," he said. "He tells me things he thinks I ought to know." He clasped his hands between his knees. "He is generally right about what I ought to know." She took a slow breath. "He put your name in the Bible 3 weeks ago," Elias said. "I saw it. I should have done it myself. I kept finding reasons to wait." He was quiet for a moment, and the wind knocked the trough chain again outside. "I want to put your name on the deed." She was still. "The farm deed," he said. "Both our names. I have to go into Colby on Tuesday to see about the wheat price. I'd like to stop at the land office first." She understood what he was offering, not words. A thing made of paper and a clerk's stamp and a county record, permanent as the family Bible and considerably more binding in a court of law. "You cannot undo that," she said. "I know. If you put my name on the deed, you cannot take it back regardless of how things go between us." "I know that too." He met her eyes. "I am not planning for it to go badly." She looked at the basin. The steam had mostly gone, but the water was still warm. "All right," she said. She said it the way she said most things, plainly, because she meant it. Tuesday, he went to Colby and came back in the late afternoon with a copy of the amended deed and a peppermint stick for Thomas, which was not a thing he had done before and which Thomas received with the solemnity of a child who understands that a gesture can be new even in a family that has been doing other things for years. Elias put the deed on the mantel beside the Bible. No words about it. No ceremony of any kind. He set it down, took his coat off, and went to wash his hands at the pump. Thomas was working at the kitchen table on his arithmetic when Hattie came in from the root cellar. He put down his pencil and went to the mantel and examined the deed without touching it. He turned and went to the barn. He came back 10 minutes later with a small flat stone he had cleaned in the creek, which he set on top of the deed to keep it from curling in the dry air. She asked him why a stone. "So it doesn't blow away," he said, as if this were obvious, as if it were merely practical, as if he were not 8 years old doing the simplest and most permanent thing he could think of to make sure something stayed where it had been put. She let it stand. On the first Sunday of December, the three of them drove to the church in Colby, and she sat between Elias and Thomas in the third pew from the front, which was where the Voss family had sat for 2 generations according to Thomas, who had this information with great precision. Mrs. Aldrich, 2 rows behind, leaned over to say something to the woman beside her, and the woman glanced over. And Hattie sat straight and sang the hymn she knew and did not turn around. Thomas had her hymn book before she found the page. He held it open at the right place and did not say anything about it. Outside afterward, while Elias talked to the grain merchant about the green wheat price, Thomas stood beside her on the church steps and watched the people moving through the cold December air. "Pa says we will try for a better wheat year," he said. "I think you will get one. He says you figured the arithmetic on the note faster than he did." I had a good teacher. She meant her grandmother, and Thomas knew she did. "Me too," he said, and he meant her, and she knew he did. She put her hand briefly on his shoulder. He stood a little straighter. Elias finished with the grain merchant and came across the churchyard with his coat collar turned up. He glanced at his son and at Hattie and at the placement of her hand, and something in his face did what it does in a man's face when he sees the thing he was trying to arrange happen by itself without any of his effort. He didn't say anything about it. That was enough. That was, in fact, the kind of enough that takes years to know how to want. She had wanted it for a long time without a name for it. And now she had it, and it was cold and clear and smelled of wood smoke, and the creekstone was holding her name in place on the mantel at home, and the wheat would come in better in the spring. Every Sunday after that, Thomas held the hymn book open to the right page before she reached for it. It was a small thing. It was a habit. That is what belonging looks like when it has had time to settle, not a moment, but a habit, carried out by a child of 8 without thinking about it, because some things, once decided, no longer require deciding.